The small diner sat nestled at the edge of a sleepy town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the late morning light. The rush of early customers had already passed, and now only a few regulars filled the worn booths, sipping coffee and exchanging quiet conversations. The air was thick with the scent of fresh brewed coffee and greasy pancakes, an aroma that had become as familiar as the creak of the diner's old wooden floors. Behind the counter stood Sarah, a young woman in her 20s, wiping down the polished surface. The tiredness in her eyes was a reflection of the long hours she spent here. The job was mundane, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, pretending to smile. It wasn't what she had dreamed of when she was younger, but it paid the bills. And that was all that mattered now. She often found herself frustrated, wishing for something more, but the bills didn't care about her dreams. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, and Sarah glanced up from her work. A man had entered, his presence drawing her attention. He wore a faded military jacket, its edges worn and frayed, and his face was weathered by years of hardship. His eyes, a deep blue that seemed far too weary for someone so young, scanned the room before he made his way to the counter. He moved slowly, as though each step required more effort than it should. Sarah couldn't help the sigh that escaped her lips as she saw him. Another person who looked like he couldn't afford a cup of coffee, much less a full meal. She had seen it countless times, people coming in, wearing the weight of their struggles like a badge, expecting something for nothing. And it always seemed like the people who looked the most broken were the ones who left the smallest tips. John sat down at the counter, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the menu. Sarah watched him from the corner of her eye as she moved to take care of the other regulars. She didn't want to serve him, didn't want to deal with whatever story he'd likely try to share, but it was her job. So, with a roll of her eyes and a sigh, she walked over to him. "Hey, what can I get you?" she asked flatly, trying to keep her tone as neutral as possible. John looked up at her, his hands still shaking as he folded the menu. His voice was quiet but steady as he gave his order. "Just a coffee and toast, please." Sarah barely suppressed a scoff as she took note of his order. His clothes, torn, patched, and worn down from years of use, spoke louder than his words ever could. She could already feel the familiar annoyance rising in her chest. People like him always came in with barely enough to pay, and they never seemed to realize how hard she had to work to make ends meet. "Sure," she muttered, not bothering to hide the irritation in her voice. She turned to walk away, but couldn't help but glance back at him. The man was staring down at his hands, the shaking now more pronounced, his fingers fumbling with the edge of the menu. Sarah shook her head. Another one, she thought. Always expecting something for free, thinking he deserves more than he actually does. She didn't say any of it aloud, but the judgment was there, plain as day in the roll of her eyes. As Sarah made her way to the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling of irritation that had settled in her chest. The veteran at the counter was still there, sitting in silence, and for some reason, he seemed to have taken up too much space in her mind. She pushed open the door to the kitchen, grateful for a brief moment away from the counter. "Another day, huh?" Tina, one of the other waitresses, asked as she flipped pancakes onto a griddle. Sarah leaned against the counter, sighing as she slid her apron off her shoulders. "Yeah, same old, same old. I'm just so tired of these people who come in, don't have enough for anything, and expect you to serve them like they're royalty. Like that guy out there," she muttered, glancing toward the front of the diner. Tina raised an eyebrow. "The veteran?" "Yeah," Sarah scoffed. "I bet he's gonna sit there and order half the menu, then end up not having enough money to pay. It's always the same. They act like the world owes them something." Tina paused, flipping another pancake, then looked at Sarah with a hint of disapproval. "You're being a little hard on him, don't you think? I mean, he's just a guy who probably had a rough time, right?" Sarah shook her head, rolling her eyes. "I get it, but I've been here long enough to know the type. Military, homeless, or on the brink of it. They never tip, always want something for nothing." She sighed deeply. "I can't keep giving and giving. I've got bills, too." Tina didn't say anything more, just gave a small shrug, and the conversation drifted off as they both worked through their tasks. Sarah busied herself with preparing a new pot of coffee, her mind drifting back to John at the counter. Meanwhile, John was facing a battle of his own. His hands shook slightly as he rifled through his wallet, fingers brushing against a few crumpled bills. He stared at the small amount of money he had left. The coffee and toast he'd ordered was simple enough, but his nerves were making the process feel insurmountable. He counted again, double-checked. There were a few dollar bills and some loose change, but not enough. His heart sank. He looked around the diner, feeling his anxiety creep higher. His chest tightened, and he wished more than anything that he could disappear. The last thing he wanted was to be another person who couldn't pay for his meal. It was a constant cycle that had become too familiar. Showing up somewhere, hoping that maybe just for once he could eat without feeling ashamed. His hands fumbled with the change, trying to make it add up in his mind. The feeling of embarrassment washed over him again, the same feeling he had whenever he tried to buy something, only to realize he wasn't enough. He wasn't enough for the world, wasn't enough to fix himself, and certainly wasn't enough to make a decent living. Sarah's eyes flicked over to John as she walked past. She saw him, struggling with his wallet, his hands trembling in that way she had seen before. The faintest flicker of doubt rose in her chest, but she quickly pushed it aside, telling herself that he was just another person who couldn't take responsibility for their own life. She had to keep moving, had to keep focusing on herself. It wasn't her problem. But the divide between Sarah's frustration and John's quiet desperation grew with every passing moment. To her, he was just another face in the crowd, another person who didn't belong, but to him, every day was a quiet battle, one where he fought just to stay afloat. John's heart raced as he dug deeper into his pockets, pulling out crumpled bills and loose change. His fingers trembled as he tried to add up the money in his hands, but the numbers just didn't seem to work. The more he counted, the more it became clear he didn't have enough. Not even close. The coffee and toast he'd ordered seemed simple enough, but in reality, they felt like an unreachable luxury. John's mind raced, his anxiety rising. Maybe he should just leave. Slip out unnoticed before anyone could realize he hadn't paid. But that would be even worse. He'd be the guy who walked out without paying, a thief, a burden to everyone. No, he couldn't do that. He wasn't a thief, but he wasn't proud of what he had become either. His hands fumbled again, shaking as he tried to force the change to stretch. The isolation crept up on him like a shadow. Alone. He was always alone in these moments. The world never seemed to notice people like him, the ones who had lost so much and had nothing left to give. At the counter, Sarah noticed John's hesitation from the corner of her eye. She could see the way his hands shook, the way he was fumbling with his money, and it irritated her more than she could say. She could already tell what was happening, another person who didn't take responsibility, just expecting others to pick up the slack. Typical, Sarah thought, rolling her eyes as she walked past him. Another one who doesn't know how to manage his life, expecting a handout. Look at him, Sarah muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. People like him always act like the world owes them something. She felt the familiar anger bubbling up, as it often did when she had to deal with customers like John. Her life wasn't easy either, but no one gave her handouts. She worked hard for every penny, and she couldn't stand the thought of someone expecting sympathy without putting in the effort. Just as Sarah was about to walk away and return to the kitchen, the low murmur of voices around the diner grew louder. She froze when she heard a voice that cut through the air. A deep, firm voice that demanded attention. "Hey, you need to knock that off." Sarah turned toward the sound, startled. An older man, one of the regulars, was standing up from his booth. His face was serious, his eyes locked on her, but there was something about the way he spoke that made Sarah feel small. The other customers in the diner grew quiet, sensing the tension in the air. "You're going to treat him like that?" the older man continued, pointing toward John. "You're going to stand there and judge him, just because he looks like he doesn't have enough money? You don't know anything about him." Sarah blinked, her heart sinking. She wasn't used to being confronted like this. The diner had its share of disagreements, but never like this. She tried to respond, but the man wasn't finished. Everyone has their own struggles, he said, his voice unwavering. Some are just harder to see. You think he's here for a handout, but you don't know what he's been through. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but something stopped her. The older man turned to John, his gaze softening. I know what it's like, the man said, his voice gentler now. I've been there too. I fought in the same wars. You're not alone, son. John's eyes widened slightly. He looked up at the older man, as if hearing the words for the first time in a long while. The room felt smaller, suddenly, quieter. The older man stepped closer to John, placing a hand on his shoulder. I won't stand by and watch someone like you get treated like that. You've been through enough, and you don't deserve to be mocked. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced as she processed the revelation. The man wasn't just defending John. He was one of them, a veteran too. A man who had walked the same path as John, and had seen the struggles that came with it. The reality of the moment hit Sarah like a wave. She had judged without understanding, assumed without knowing, and now, standing in front of her, was a man who had lived the very life John was trying to survive. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. The tension in the diner thickened, like the heavy air before a storm. The older man's words had already shifted something in the room, but it wasn't just him speaking up that made the change. Slowly, other voices began to rise. A young woman sitting at one of the booths, holding a baby in her arms, stood up and looked directly at Sarah. I've been through some rough times too, the woman said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I know what it's like to struggle, to wonder where your next meal's coming from. But I'm not going to sit here and let someone be treated like that. Not today. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though the whole room was turning against her. Another man from a nearby table, a middle-aged guy with a graying beard, nodded in agreement. We all have our battles, he said. You never know what someone's been through. That's no reason to treat them like they're less than human. One by one, more customers chimed in, their voices building with a collective strength that Sarah hadn't expected. A couple who had been sitting quietly near the window stood together, speaking in unison. She shouldn't have judged him like that. We all face tough times, the woman said, her voice firm. The diner, usually filled with the hum of background chatter, now felt like a united front. Every person who spoke up seemed to carry a shared understanding, as if this moment of collective humanity had drawn them together in a way that Sarah hadn't considered. They had all been through something that connected them beyond their differences, beyond their struggles. Sarah stood there frozen as the words kept coming. At first, it was just irritation, the sting of being called out in front of everyone. But then, as she glanced around the room, something shifted inside her. Her gaze lingered on John, sitting quietly at the counter, and she suddenly saw him not as a stranger or someone she had judged, but as a person. Someone who had likely fought battles far more difficult than she could ever imagine. Her face flushed with embarrassment as the weight of the situation hit her. She had acted out of frustration, a frustration born from her own hardships. She hadn't seen John for who he was, someone who had served his country, who had been through things she could never truly understand. She hadn't seen the silent pain in his eyes, the kind of pain that wasn't obvious, the kind that didn't have a clear path to healing. The voices of the other customers faded as she focused on the realization settling in her chest. Sarah took a deep breath, the shame washing over her like a tide. She had judged too quickly, let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had missed the humanity of the man in front of her. Hesitantly, Sarah approached John, her steps slow but purposeful. She stopped in front of him, her heart racing as she took in his nervous, unsure expression. "John?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with caution, unsure of what she would say next. "I'm sorry," she began, her words awkward but sincere. "I never should have judged you like that. I was wrong to assume. I didn't know your story. I didn't know what you've been through." John blinked, still hesitant, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice shaky but understanding. I understand. I didn't want to cause trouble. Sarah felt a knot loosen in her chest as she looked at him. "You didn't cause any trouble," she assured him, her voice growing steadier. I was wrong. I should have seen you as a person, not just someone who looked like they couldn't pay." John nodded slowly, offering a faint, almost hesitant smile. He didn't say anything more, but in that quiet exchange, something changed between them. And for Sarah, it was a moment of realization, a turning point that she would carry with her from then on. Just as Sarah turned to head back to the kitchen, the older man who had defended John earlier made his way over to the counter. Sarah watched in silence, unsure of what was happening. The man walked right up to John, who still sat nervously, clutching the money he hadn't been able to pay with moments ago. "John," the older man said, his voice firm but kind, "you don't have to worry about paying for your meal. I've been where you are, and I won't let you leave feeling ashamed. I understand." John looked up at him, stunned. His eyes widened as the man reached into his own wallet and handed over the cash to Sarah. "This one's on me," he said to her, his tone final. "And don't you dare make him feel less than. We've all walked different paths, but we're all in this together." The words hung in the air, filling the diner with a deep, unexpected silence. Sarah watched in shock as the older man patted John on the back, a gesture that spoke volumes more than any words could. And then, just as the last of the tension seemed to melt away, the room seemed to shift in an almost surreal way. One by one, the customers who had spoken up earlier began to act on their own words. The woman with the baby, who had stood up in Sarah's defense, walked over to the counter and put a few extra bills in the tip jar with a firm nod. "It's about time you learned some compassion," she said to Sarah, a knowing look in her eyes. Another regular, a man who had been sipping coffee in the corner, stood up and handed a couple of bills to Sarah. "This is for your education," he said, winking. "You're learning something today, and that's worth something." Sarah felt her chest tighten, the weight of their words slowly sinking in. The kindness that poured from the customers, from people who had every right to stay silent, was overwhelming. The diner that had once felt so small and routine was now full of something much deeper: human connection. The older man, after paying for John's meal, took a step back and gave him a warm smile. "Don't be ashamed, son. We all have our battles. You've done your time. Now, let someone else take care of you for once." John nodded slowly, his eyes moist with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but full of meaning. "You don't know how much this means to me." As John slowly stood up and made his way toward the door, he turned to face the room. "Thank you, all of you," he said, his voice shaking but full of genuine appreciation. "I didn't think I deserved any of this, but you've shown me that I do." He gave a small smile, almost apologetic but sincere, and then walked out into the cold morning air. Sarah stood behind the counter, utterly still, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and deep reflection. The room had transformed. What had started as a moment of frustration and judgment had become a lesson in empathy and human connection. She had never realized how far kindness could ripple, how small actions could have such a profound effect on someone's life. As she quietly cleaned up, she couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. In that single moment, her perception of the world had shifted. She now understood the power of empathy, the importance of looking beyond the surface, and how much her own actions could change the course of someone's day, or even their life. The door jingled behind her, and she glanced up to see the older man leaving with a small nod in her direction. He didn't say anything more, but the quiet approval in his eyes spoke volumes. Sarah stood there for a long moment, reflecting. The diner, once just a place of routine, had become something more. A reminder that no one is ever truly alone in their struggles, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest waves. And as the customers finished their meals and left, Sarah realized something important. This was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she would carry with her a deeper understanding of others and the lessons she'd learned on that ordinary day in the diner. If you've enjoyed this story and the powerful message of kindness and understanding, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others. Your support helps us bring more stories that touch hearts and remind us all of the importance of compassion. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment below. Thank you for being a part of this community.